So if we consider going all the way back to the very beginning with the Big Bang, we need to form stars and have those stars die because we needed hydrogen from the Big Bang in order to create stars. So I'm going to try to walk through the rest of the steps in the early universe that set us up for being able to have life. So our next step after the earliest stars form and die is that the Earth and, the sun, solar system, second generation stars, the Earth will form. So why is one generation of stars needed before the Earth formed in order to have life? Okay, yes. So we need heavier atoms than just helium in order to make life, right? And so we need another generation of stars to form those heavier atoms. So the life and death of the earliest stars turns hydrogen into helium, but also heavier elements. And the most important of the heavy elements for our purposes is carbon. So we and all the rest of life on Earth is based around carbon. And it turns out carbon only forms very near the end of most stars' lives. So when they're in the process of dying. And carbon is very useful for life, mostly because it can make 4 atomic bonds with other atoms. Some of these are other carbon atoms, and so chains of carbon atoms give us complex molecules like sugars and other things like hydrogen and oxygen, nitrogen. Those can also bond to carbons, and then those functional groups can make more complex interactions with organic molecules. This is all organic chemistry, right? Another complicated topic, a class I never actually took. But anyway, carbon is useful. It has such a complex chemistry that there's an entire chemistry class devoted just to that, right? All right, so this carbon chemistry, having all the carbon here, this is how we're going to start to form some of those complex molecules in order to make our way towards amino acids and towards nucleotides. But in order to do so, we need to have favorable conditions for chemistry to happen, right? So those I guess, precursors to the precursors, so all the carbon and stuff and, very simple atoms and molecules like were in the Miller-Urey experiment, we assume that they were sort of in some sort of aqueous water phase. And so that's why we call this the primordial soup hypothesis. So you've got all this stuff that's basically in the early oceans. And we don't know if it came here from rocks, space rocks, or if it actually formed here, right? Anyway, this is our typical environment for chemistry. This is basically the idea that early Earth is like a chemistry beaker. All right, and we assume that out of this, life emerges. So how does that happen? We really have no idea. But this is basically the hypothesis that we're working with. We don't know exactly how life formed on early Earth, but we know when it formed because we have some fossil evidence of that early time. And the earliest fossil evidence is what we call stromatolites. So these are basically bacteria piles. So just kind of like the scum on a bottom of a lake, basically building up over time and forming these piles of dead cells. And those actually left little fossil records. So you can read more about that here in this Nature article. And then other things that we find are little, I want to call them like microspheres of where our cells actually started to collect into very early primitive multicellular forms. So instead of a single-celled bacteria, which would have been kind of the earliest sort of life, now you've got sort of colonies, and then these colonies eventually could develop into multicellular life down the line. So if you look at the numbers here, the very earliest evidence is 3.7 billion years ago. So that's a pretty long time ago. The entire solar system is not much younger than like 4 billion years. So pretty much as soon as it was favorable for Earth to start forming life, it did. This was right around the time when the period of heavy bombardment in the early solar system, so like all of the asteroids and protoplanetesimal pieces that were still floating around the early solar system, they were just constantly crashing into planets. That period of early bombardment ended around 3.8 billion years ago, and then boom, life starts at 3.7 billion years ago. So to kind of wrap that up in a nutshell, we've got the Earth forming around 4.5 billion years ago. And then very quickly after the early bombardment ends, we get single-celled organisms, and then multicellular organisms, aquatic plants, aquatic animals, things that live on land. There should be an emoji of dinosaurs going bye-bye here. And then humans emerge at the very end. So we're just a very recent addition to this whole story. You can trace the evolution of life back through what we think of as an evolutionary tree. So if you think about the extreme diversity of life that we have today, all of the mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, fungi, plants, and bacteria, and other things, which I'm not sure what protostomes are. Need to take a bio class for that one, I suppose. All of this can ultimately be traced back in time toward a single common ancestor. So we want to understand kind of this last piece, right, of how humans emerged in order to appreciate what we might want to know or assume when we're trying to communicate with other intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe. But really, this is, just the very last piece. So if we think about this last piece of human evolution, this also only spans around here 10 million years, tracing back our family tree toward even a place where we split with old world monkeys, right? And this is just one very tiny piece of that entire family tree that fans out the entire diversity of life. If you're curious about some of these things, you can find lots of more information online or in other bio classes. But so our most recent split was with Australopithecus. And just for reference, Australopithecus is, sort of what we would have considered to be a missing link until we found it between the old world monkeys such as the chimpanzee and Homo sapiens. So life evolves over time through very small changes selected for via natural selection. And so all these very small changes happen over the course of billions and billions of years. This is how we end up with our extreme diversity of life today. All right, so back to our family tree. We're going to trace it all the way back toward an early common ancestor. And a lot of time is spent, right, in these early, very simple life forms. So we know that photosynthesis is one of the important events in the history of Earth. So when did that start? Okay, less of you took the bait than I would have expected for aquatic plants or land plants. And indeed, the photosynthesis was not started by plants. Plants were not the original photosynthesizers. In fact, they're not even the dominant photosynthesizer on Earth today. Algae is. So most of the photosynthesis on Earth happens in the oceans due to the action of single-celled organisms. And the development of photosynthesis was extremely important because it started to produce oxygen. And we'll discuss in a minute why that's so critical. Okay, so in case you're not familiar, photosynthesis is just the process that converts sunlight into energy, mostly into sugars. And the process of photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and produces oxygen as a byproduct. So on the early Earth, there was an atmosphere that was composed of some of the things that outgassed from the planet early on. So just stuff that was basically dissolved in the rocks. And then when the rocks cooled into the crust, then these gases were what was left behind. And a lot of that was water, CO2, and sulfur dioxide with some nitrogen and other inert gases. But today's atmosphere is very different. It's primarily nitrogen with a considerable amount of oxygen. So there's no oxygen in the primordial atmosphere. And then carbon dioxide is a trace part of the atmosphere. So the current atmosphere is very different from the primordial atmosphere. And the reason for that is because life transformed it. So the further development of other kinds of life forms could then use this oxygen as the starting point for their metabolism, as we do, right? So not only was this process of photosynthesis important for, changing the environment of Earth, and led, paved the way for animals to exist essentially, but also it has another function. So that function is that oxygen in the atmosphere reacts with ultraviolet radiation to produce ozone. And ozone is important because this protects life from UV radiation. UV radiation generally is able to damage DNA. And so if you're in a highly, radiated UV environment, it would seem like life would not be a very friendly place for life. So this is the other really critical part of this photosynthesis process, creating lots of oxygen so that Earth gets an ozone layer. So photosynthesis, probably one of the most important steps as far as I'm concerned about evolution in the early Earth.